All right, well, we are in the final message, the end. We've reached the end of our long summer series that we've been calling Christ in Culture, and hopefully we've done a thorough enough job sort of laying out the process of contextualizing our faith. But that leads to the question for today. The million-dollar question at the end of this is, well, was it worth it? Is it worth it to really go through all of this? If you've been with us the whole time, we've tried to provide some helpful frameworks and ideas and graphics and ways of thinking through things, the sources of authority that we consider, the way that we read each of those, the way that those all kind of interact with each other, the point of coming to an actual judgment at the end of it, or a conclusion at the end of it. So hopefully that's been helpful. But if you're like me, a little insight into my brain here, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, that looks like a lot of work, right? And honestly, who's got time for that? So I think as we get to the end here, this very last message in the series, it is important to count the cost, because we did lay it out. We've kind of appropriately complicated things, showing you how much work and effort really goes into it. So that's the important question to ask. Is it actually worth it to go through this? Now, in order to evaluate, basically anything, in order to evaluate this, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at and kind of remember why we started this in the first place, what we were hoping to accomplish, what happens if we just don't engage in a process like this, and then to look at, does it actually produce? Does it set out to do what we wanted it to? Does it actually produce the kinds of lives that we're looking for out of the process? So that's kind of the journey for this morning. So let me remind you of why we started this in the first place. Right, if you go back to our first message on May 30th and you look through the first few messages into June, it might be worth going back for a refresher, or if you're new joining us for the first time, maybe pause right now and go start on May 30th and work through it that way. But we basically had two... We gave two reasons, or kind of two purposes, why we're getting into this, why we're going through this process. The first is because we have to. Right? Christianity is a culturally contextualized reality. It always needs to be embedded in a culture. There's no such thing as a pure form of Christianity. It's been that way since the beginning. You can go look in the New Testament at the different letters Paul wrote to different churches in different geographies, and you'll see some differences, some different advice and suggestions. You'll see things contextualized differently. And you can compare those to the early church in Acts in Jerusalem, or even some of the other letters from Paul or from Peter and John, or even in Hebrews. So you'll see that even at the very beginning, they were contextualizing, they were translating. It's part of the journey. It's what we always have to do. Now, a quick side note here: what we're talking about when we're talking about translating is more or less in the realm of theological opinion. Okay, so if you watched the message last week, Mike used kind of showed a diagram of concentric circles where there's core beliefs, dogma, doctrine, and then the outermost circle is theological opinion. And the importance is that what we're doing when we talk about translating our faith or contextualizing our faith is most likely in that theological opinion range, right? We're taking those kind of first three circles, the core beliefs, the dogma, the doctrine, and interacting with culture around us to sort of form these opinions. And so that's kind of the journey that we're doing, right? We've said that, that's why we use the word translating. We're not just coming up with brand new messages. There's an original message that's worth translating into, to contextualize into our culture. But that just means it puts us in the realm of that sort of theological opinion. So that was part one of the answer there. We started this process, because we have to. We have to. It's always culturally contextualized. So that was the reason we started on it. But the goal, why we are laying our cards out on the table here, why we're inviting everybody into this process, is because the goal of it, just because the goal of our faith, is to grow up in love. right? The object, the goal of our faith is to be perfected in love, right? As Christians, we are students of love. We learn love from God, who is in essence love, and we learn to love from following Jesus. And so what we're hoping to accomplish out of this process, why we would engage in it, is not just because we have to, but because it ought to, hopefully, form us or grow us up in love. So that was kind of the agenda. So those are kind of the motivations. That's what started or kicked off this process, this long, months-long journey we've been on. So, again, if you are like me, I don't want to use the word lazy, so I'll just say you conserve energy well. So, but if you're like me and you want to conserve energy, you might ask the question then of okay, I see that, but what if I just don't do it at all, right? I see that it might be better to engage in that process, but is it really that bad if I don't? So that's what we'll look into right now, right? Let's play it out. I want you to think of a community, a church community. It could be any. This is all communities we're a part of, but think specifically of a church community, and let's play out what happens. Imagine a community where there are lots of very strong opinions. Might take you a little while. Try to just think and imagine a community where there's just a lot of very strong opinions. And those opinions aren't very thoughtfully, theologically formed. I know that sounds harsh, but the reality is we all carry all sorts of opinions, and the way we typically get them is by adopting them. Right, we typically, they're passed down to us from the various subcultures we're a part of. We pick some up from family and friends, or, work environments we're in, or communities we live in, or broader culture. So there are things that kind of get passed down to us and we adopt, or we might see a new opinion or idea come across our face and say, oh, I think I like that, and kind of adopt it as our own. But that's kind of the end of it, right? We're not thoughtfully forming them. We most often just adopt opinions as our own. Okay, so imagine it's a pretty normal thing, a normal experience. So imagine a church community where there are a lot of strong opinions that aren't theologically and thoughtfully formed. What would a community like that feel like? What would it look like? What would your experience be there? One danger of not engaging in a process like this and forming our theological opinions is that we blur the line between what is opinion and what is more central, right? What's dogma or doctrine or even core beliefs. And when we blur the lines, it means that we often lift up our opinion as being more important than it actually is. And when we do that, we often think we are more right than we actually are, because we're not considering a broader culture, right? So one danger of not engaging in kind of a robust process like this is that, our opinions sort of get elevated to being of higher importance than they ought to be. And because we don't engage in a process of listening to other authorities and listening to other people's experiences and fully forming an idea, we tend to think we are more right than we actually are. Right, so play that out a little bit. What happens in a culture or a community or an environment when we hold our opinions of higher importance than they ought to be, and we think we are more right than we actually are. Right? We very easily start to see people that don't line up, that don't agree with us, as outsiders. We tend to see them more judgmentally, right? We can come to overly simplistic and often immature judgments because we're not hearing from other people, and so it creates this, kind of us or them sort of spirit. Right? And what eventually goes on to happen, right? What eventually happens if we're not intentionally engaging in thoughtful process like this, is we start to view people as enemies. We start to create enemies. I don't mean that we create people who are hostile to us. I mean we start to view them as threats, right? Because they challenge the thing that we think is more important than it actually is, and they challenge how right we actually think we are. And so there's a lot of psychological bias and barrier built into that to view them in a way of at least judging them and viewing them sort of as objects, at worst to sort of view them as threats or enemies. And if you play that out in a church community, it means it doesn't look any different than broader culture around us, right? The loudest opinions are sort of the least thought out. The stakes of believing or not believing, or agreeing or not agreeing, are consistently getting higher and higher. And there's a growing us versus them spirit in it. We see that all around us. It's not just within cultures, but between cultures. And the church, right? The church really ought to be different, and we probably want it to be different. But, one of Jesus' favorite tools for evaluating, is he would say is by judging the fruit. Right? So at the end of his Sermon on the Mount, one of his most famous teaching passages, he ends in Matthew 7 saying, a good tree bears good fruit, a bad tree bears bad fruit. Right? Meaning whatever seeds of thought were planted, the fruit of them will show up in our actions, how we actually live out. And so if we don't engage in a more robust, communal, thoughtful process of forming our theological opinions, what kind of fruit does that produce? Does it produce a life where I am more thoughtful and considerate of others, where I empathize with their needs, lift them up higher than myself, where I'm more generous? Right? Or does it produce a fruit where I'm, maybe quicker to anger, that I'm prone to sort of us or them thinking. I'm more self-centered than other-centered, right? I make decisions based off what's right for me or what's best for me. And maybe I really quickly or simply explain away other people's experiences if they don't line up with me. Right? Which fruit does it produce? More loving, or the same fruit that we're just sort of all living in and experiencing right now? Now, I think that's the spirit behind Paul's letter when he writes to one of his students, Timothy. Paul sort of leaves his parting words of advice to him in 1 Timothy 4:16. And he says, to watch your life and teaching closely, right? For your salvation and the salvation of those around you. Another way it's translated as to watch your life and doctrine closely. Now, I think the spirit behind that is Paul talking about what is your teaching actually producing in your life? But oftentimes we view that, we can view that phrase in a very different way, right? If salvation means heaven after I die, and if doctrine means believing the right things in order to get there, then it's really easy to interpret that verse as I just need to guard and protect my doctrine so that I get to where I want to go in the end. And so I have to keep other people away or at a distance, or keep their influence at a distance, because they threaten my ticket to heaven. They threaten my doctrine. And so it creates kind of a watchdog, a guarding your doctrine sort of mentality. But I think what Paul's getting at, why he says watch your life and teaching closely, is the same kind of thing that Jesus was talking about. It's make sure your life is producing the very thing that it's supposed to produce. If you are not seeing yourself as more loving in your life, then back it up and examine your teaching. Is there something wrong with your teaching that's bearing fruit other than the fruit of love? I think that's a big part of what Paul is getting at, that it's a relationship, that we ought to be evaluating our lives based on whether or not we are more loving than when we started. And if we are not, if we're not seeing any type of growth or maturity in love, go back and reevaluate your teaching, right? Paul would say, if it doesn't lead to love, get rid of it. Right? Jesus would say something similar. I mean, he talks about this in Matthew 11 after he kind of gets accused from being a glutton and a drunkard. He says, wisdom is proved right by her actions. Right? So Jesus is saying we will know what is wise based off when we see wise living. Right? In other words, right thinking should produce right living. If we're not living rightly, we're probably thinking wrongly somewhere. And so Jesus would say, go back to what you're thinking and make sure that those two things are lining up, that what you're seeing produced in your life is that spirit of love, and it's consistent with the teaching. And if not, then there's something wrong with the teaching. Right? Back to the 1 Timothy verse, Paul talks about for your salvation and the salvation of others. Right? That he's telling Timothy, watch your life and doctrine, make sure it's producing what it ought to produce. That it should be producing salvation in you and those around you. Not think about that in terms of it ought to be bringing life. Make sure your life and your teaching is bringing life to you and those around you for your salvation, for their salvation. That communal impact together. This isn't a private punch your ticket into heaven situation, right? It's a seeing yourself being saved over time through this process that you're of evaluating your life and your teaching based off of what it's producing in you. So if it doesn't lead to love, right? Get rid of it. But that creates its own set of problems, right? We're not very good at recognizing that individually, whether or not we are loving, right? We all view ourselves as the heroes of our own stories, right? And so if we desire to be more loving, we often view ourselves as more loving than we actually are, right? Jesus might say, before you take the speck out of your brother's eye, remove the plank from your own. Right? I think that's what he's getting at. It's always easier to see where somebody else isn't loving as much. Right? It's always easier to see someone else's fault than it is to see our own, to see where we are falling short. Right? But the point of it is not your individual clarity. Right? It's not just, I'm going to take the plank out of my eye and, oh, great, I can see clearly. That's the goal of it. The goal is for both of you to see clearly, right? That we need each other to help refine our lives, to help shape us, to help bring out the ways that we are, the ways we're not seeing clear, the ways we're not living rightly, that comes out in community. And this is something that Dana talked about a couple weeks ago, that this theological process that we've laid out, that it by necessity it's a communal process. Right? It's communal not just because of our own individual limitations, although that's there. We need other people to point things out that we can't see because we're things that we are blind to ourselves. Right? We need other people for that. But it's not just that. It's the community, we need the community to help strengthen us, but that the purpose of it is that we help strengthen community. It's not my individual discernment, it's the building up of one another towards love, that's why this has to be a communal process. It's not your individual discernment, that's not the point. That's great, but that's not the point. The point is to build one another up in love. Right, Paul talks about this in his letter to the church in Corinth, where he lays out a grid for us to think about, a kind of priority of what he calls gifts of the Spirit. Right, I can't get into too much of it right now, but there was a little bit of the context in the church in Corinth is that people were paying more attention to. They wanted this like deeply personal, private worship experience, and Paul is trying to elevate the community. So he's addressing it in terms of speaking in tongues and prophesying. Right, now I know you might have some strong reactions to those words. You might have some baggage in your past from ways that you've heard those before. We're not going to get into that right now, but the important point is to think about the Spirit, what Paul's getting at, what's behind it. What Paul is saying is that, the priority of your personal worship experience versus the priority of a public communal worship. So think in those terms as I read here. So this is in chapter 14. It's the first couple of verses. So Paul says this, "Let love be your highest goal, but you should also desire the special abilities the Spirit gives, especially the ability to prophesy. For if you have the ability to speak in tongues, you will be talking only to God, since people won't be able to understand you. You will be speaking by the power of the Spirit, but it will all be mysterious. But one who prophesies strengthens others, encourages them, and comforts them. A person who speaks in tongues is strengthened personally, but one who speaks a word of prophecy strengthens the entire church." So you see Paul's point of emphasis here, right? First off, love is the goal. That's the objective. That's what we're all moving towards. That's the telos of our faith, right? We're all working towards being grown and matured and formed and perfected in love. So let that be the highest goal. And if that's the highest goal, then we need to prioritize building up of the community versus just our own private experience. It didn't say that the private experience is bad, right? I hope if you've been with us this whole time through this series, that maybe you have found some helpful things. You have come to some helpful conclusions to discern, or some helpful opinions yourself that you hold. And that's beneficial, but that's not the point. That really falls short. The point is for us to grow in love, and the way that we do that is by strengthening one another. Right? Because the stronger the community, right, the more mature the community is in love, the more mature you will become. Right? The more clarity you'll have, the closer experience to God you'll feel, the more you'll be challenged and refined and perfected. That it has to be in relationship to the community. Later on in the chapter, Paul goes on to sort of lay out, knowing the context that there was people that wanted to, were prioritizing speaking in tongues. He goes out to give them a formula here's what your worship service should look like. So later in the chapter, here's what he says in verse 29. He says, "Let 2 or 3 people prophesy, and let the others evaluate what is said. But if someone is prophesying and another person receives a revelation from the Lord, the one who is speaking must stop. In this way, all who prophesy will have a turn to speak, one after the other, so that everyone will learn and be encouraged." So I hope you caught that. He says, okay, we should have other voices in the room when we're worshiping. Other people should be able to speak up, to prophesy, to give what they feel like is a word from the Spirit. But, incredibly important here, but it needs to be evaluated by the community. Right? So people are going to bring their sort of word, their thought, maybe their opinion into the conversation, but it needs to be evaluated among the community. And they need to make sure that everybody gets a turn that feels that call to speak. So that everybody can learn and everybody can be encouraged. Right? The community is lifted up. We are better individually when we are better together. All towards that direction of love. Right? So let's come back to my initial question. What's kind of driving all of this, right? It's a lot of work, right? Is it worth it, right? Is engaging in this process? Does it produce in us lives that are more loving than it would be without it, right? I think it would. And I also think it produces in us, like the way that happens is when we do it together, right? I didn't mention this earlier, but again, a little insight into the, we'll call it energy conservation that I feel, right? It would be, well, why can't you just do it for me? Right? Why can't just whoever's teaching come up here and go through this process and hand it to me? Well, I think it's because there's the function of the process itself, of engaging with other sources ourselves, of hearing from each other and other people and others' experiences ourselves, that going through that together is what will grow us up in love. Way more than just listening to one person and, getting out of that whatever few things you might get out of it. That there's something about engaging in a process like this, forming our theological opinions, contextualizing together, that forms us all up in love. And if that is actually happening, I know it's a lot of work, but if that is actually happening, then it's worth it. 'Cause think about it. Where else in your life are you voluntarily, intentionally opening yourself up to being perfected in love? Meaning being criticized, refined, built up. People that are pointing out the ways that you're falling short of this goal, this telos of love. Where are you doing that intentionally? I mean, I think most people in my life that I've talked to will say something to the effect of, I want to be a more loving person. Okay? I would say that that's true of most people that I know. But what they usually mean by that is something more along the lines of like tolerance, right? We just need to accept people and give them the freedom to be who they want to be. That we need to love everybody in that way, right? So it's not, it's not really saying I want to be more loving, right? It's more akin to tolerance. But that aside, I hear so many people say I want to be more loving, and yet I don't know of anybody, really, maybe a handful of people in my life, in my experience, that actually critically evaluate their life and whether or not they are more loving 6 months down the road than they were 6 months ago, or more loving today than I was 6 months ago, whether or not they'll be more loving 6 months down the road, right? Whether or not they are more thoughtful and compassionate and empathetic, whether or not they are quicker to forgive than they used to be, to actually see their enemies as people, to extend love to them, to the people who would oppose them, that they would listen and hear their arguments and concerns and see their humanity, right? People who in 6 months from now can give more of themselves, more of their money, more of their time, more of their lives, that they're thinking of others more than just of themselves. I don't know of many people that are critically looking at their life or evaluating their life that way. I want to be more loving, but I'm not actually doing the work to look at, is that what's being produced in my life? Because if not, then I need to find something else. And I hope that this process, engaging this process in a community like this, is what will do that. So, since you're joining us digitally, I want to ask you to do something today. I want to invite you to come to an in-person service. I know there's a lot that might go into that, and maybe you haven't been with us for a while. I invite you to come back, or maybe you're just checking us out digitally. I would invite you to come for the first time. But hopefully you see the importance of needing to do this in community. Right? We need others for the discernment process, not just to make us better, but that we are all better when we are all better, when we all grow in love. That there's something central about the community in this process that we can't skirt around. And so I invite you to come on a Sunday morning. You can expect something very different than this. Right, this message will post, this digital message will post on a Friday. I will give the same message 2 days later on Sunday morning, but it's going to be very different. I'm not going to talk as much. I'm going to, throw out a few points. Other people are going to share. It's a dialogue model. So other people are going to weigh in. They're going to share about their experience or the way that they've seen this played out in their life. They might raise an issue or concern or a question that I didn't think to raise, right? Just like, 1 Corinthians 14, there's going to be some people that talk too much, that need to give space for others. But we are very intentional about why we're doing our process the way that we are, because the way that we can best be formed and grown and matured in love is to build up one another, to do that together, the need of doing that in community. And so I would invite you, if you haven't come back in a while, or if you've been just checking us out online only, to come in person. You can find the times and directions and stuff on our website, because that's what we're trying to accomplish. That's what we're trying to do. That's why we go through all of this work. We lay out this long series. We go through all the headaches. That's why we have the model the way that it is, so that we would be more loving people than we were before. And I hope that would be true of you, of any church community that you would choose to be a part of, but especially ours, that you can look at your life that in 6 months from now, I am more thoughtful, I am more compassionate, I seek out people who would oppose me. I don't see this us or them mentality. I see the interconnectedness of all people, but I intentionally try to engage their ideas and get their thoughts and consider their experiences, right? That I would see my life be more generous in very tangible ways. My thought life, my prayer life, how I'm spending my time, the things that I'm scheduling or not scheduling, where my money is going, right? Where, what kind of relationships I'm developing, right? I hope that you would be a part of our community as we go through a process like this together. This is what we do basically every week. That we would be formed in love, and that in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, you would look back and say in very specific, tangible ways, I am more loving than I was then because of that community. And if that is true, then the effort of this process will have been worth it. And I hope and pray that you will find it worth it.
Bridges that cannot be burned. It speaks truth that cannot be learned. It's a treasure we can never earn. Oh, it goes places we're afraid of going. It's not a fist, it's a hand wide open, reaching out to the down and broken. We believe your love is the strongest way. You're tearing down walls and you break our chains. Even in this darkness, hope will rise again. When we lay down our weapons, we will let love win. Lord, we lay down our weapons and we let love win. Love is a friend to its enemies. It takes a hit, then turns a cheek. You lay down your life for peace. Oh, love won't cast a single stone. It's never proven by words alone. You come alive in our flesh and bones, and in our souls. We believe your love is the strongest way. You're tearing down walls and you break our chains. Even in this darkness, tearing down walls and you break our chains. Even in this darkness, hope will rise again. When we lay down our weapons, we will let love win. We believe your love is the strongest way. You're tearing down walls and you break our chains. Even in this darkness, hope will rise again. When we lay down our weapons, we will let love win. Lord, we lay down our weapons and we let love win.
So I hope you have found this edifying and encouraging, maybe a little challenging. But I hope that you also realize the limitations that would come. All right, you can watch this on these digital messages. They're here for you, but you can watch them on the couch in your underwear on a weekend morning, or you can listen to them through a podcast app while you're driving or doing laundry. And I hope that would be valuable and encouraging, but it's going to end there. I hope you see and you know that there's a much bigger story and purpose for you to be a part of. That you will grow in love when we can all grow in love. That our maturity collectively is so important and is so beneficial to you individually. And so I hope that you would consider being a part of a group of people in person, whether it's coming to our in-person services, or if it's just grabbing a few other friends, people, families, and getting together in homes, but to engage in a process of evaluating our lives and seeing if we are really tangibly more loving today than we were 3 months ago, 6 months ago. And in 6 months from now, we would do the same thing. That the reason we engage in this process is to be more fully formed and loved. As Paul said, let love be our highest goal, and let's evaluate everything in our lives around that. Let's pray. Gracious God, we love you and we praise you for who you are. As we've come to know you through your Son, Jesus, through your Spirit, we can be convinced that you are in essence love, that you are a being, a relationship of other-centered love, and that there is an invitation in our lives to participate in that, to be a part of the Trinity, of living that out into our world. I pray that we would take our faith seriously, that we would intentionally put ourselves in places where we are challenged and challenged to grow, that we would put ourselves in places where we are being refined and perfected, that we would find ourselves more kind, more patient, more forgiving, more other-centered, more generous with our time and our resources and our money and our thoughts, that we'd have a wider network of people around us, that we would find the abundance of life that comes in participating in your mission in the world, that we would see ourselves as more loving and we would experience a world that is more loving because of that. So I thank you for all of us. Pray that you continue to draw us to yourself and draw us to each other and continue to lead us and guide us through your Spirit on that mission. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.